Husband made me a cup of coffee, which had a very strange smell. I swapped mugs with my sills. And this story is very meaningful. Everyone should hear it. Listen to Brian tell the story. Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey? James's voice was smooth, but his smile felt off. It didn't reach his eyes. Something about the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the coffee cup he placed in front of me, inhaling deeply. There was a scent beneath the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Something metallic. Something wrong. Nina, my sister-in-law, sat across from me at her extravagant dining table. She was stirring her own cup, her long manicured nails tapping lightly against the porcelain. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile I had learned to fear. My name is Christina, and I never thought I'd be sitting here, questioning whether my own husband was trying to poison me. But after 3 years of marriage, after countless unexplained bouts of food poisoning, after the tea that landed me in urgent care last month, I had learned to be careful, especially around Nina. She had a way of orchestrating situations that left me sick or humiliated, always with that same innocent smile James was wearing now. "How thoughtful of you," I said, forcing a smile as my mind raced. I lifted the cup slowly, pretending to take a sip, all the while watching their reactions. Nina's eyes flickered with amusement. James watched me too closely, anticipation tightening his jaw. Something was wrong. I needed to act fast. "Oh, would you look at that?" I said suddenly, glancing at my phone. "I need to make a quick call for work." I stood up, pretending to be distracted, and as I walked past Nina's place setting, I stumbled, grabbing onto the table to steady myself. In the split second of movement, my hands switched our coffee cups. Nina barely noticed, only rolling her eyes at my supposed clumsiness. "Just try not to break anything," she said dryly. I nodded, hiding my pounding heartbeat as I stepped away, slipping into the study while keeping an eye on them from the doorway. James turned to Nina, his voice casual. "So, what do you think?" Nina lifted the coffee cup, my cup, to her lips and took a sip. My stomach clenched. James had expected me to drink that. He thought I wouldn't notice. But I did, and now I needed to see what happened next. Nina took another sip, her expression neutral at first, but then her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup down. "James!" Her voice wavered. "Something's wrong." James frowned, his casual act slipping. "What?" She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "I feel—" Her voice trailed off, and suddenly her entire body stiffened. James's eyes widened in realization, and he shot up from his chair, knocking it over in the process. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But in the silence of the room, I heard it clear as day. My blood ran cold. James wasn't surprised she was reacting. He was surprised it wasn't me. Nina gasped, gripping the edge of the table, her face twisting in confusion and pain. "What did you put in that coffee?" Her voice was shaky now, her fingers twitching as if she was losing control of her limbs. James didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, watching his sister, the woman he had always sworn to protect, drink the very thing he had meant for me. I stepped out of the study, my phone already recording. "You need to call an ambulance," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos unfolding in front of me. James snapped his head toward me, his expression a mix of anger and panic. "Christina, this isn't what you think." "James." Nina's voice was barely above a whisper now. Her breathing was labored. "Call an ambulance." His hesitation lasted too long, so I dialed 911 myself. "Hello, emergency services?" "Yes, we need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive. My sister-in-law is having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. I glanced at James as I spoke. His hands were shaking. Nina, barely able to keep her eyes open, looked at me, her lips parted in realization. "You switched," she gasped, her voice filled with both horror and admiration. The dispatcher's voice was calm. "Help is on the way, ma'am. Stay on the line." I didn't hang up. I kept my phone steady, pointing it at James. He looked at Nina. He looked at me. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He ran. He bolted out of the dining room, heading for the front door. Coward. I followed, catching sight of him as he fumbled with the lock, his hands slick with sweat. "Running won't fix this," I called after him. He turned back, his eyes wild. "You don't understand. Christina, I was just—" The sound of sirens cut him off. Flashing red and blue lights filled the street outside as an ambulance and a police car pulled up. Too late. James. As officers rushed in, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was it. The moment where everything would come to light. The truth, the lies, the betrayal, and the consequences. James was yanked backward as two officers restrained him. Nina was being lifted onto a stretcher, her breathing shallow but stable. And I stood there, watching, recording, making sure none of them could twist this into anything other than what it was. Attempted murder. This wasn't the ending James had planned, but it was the one he deserved. And it was only just beginning. The hospital was cold, sterile, filled with the sound of beeping monitors and hushed conversations. I sat in the waiting room, my phone clutched in my hand, replaying the recording I had captured at Nina's house. Every word, every panicked confession, was a nail in James's coffin. I glanced at the time. James had been taken in for questioning almost an hour ago. Nina was still unconscious, hooked up to monitors, her body fighting against whatever poison had been in that coffee. A nurse finally called my name. "Mrs. Bennett, the doctor would like to speak with you." I stood up, smoothing out my shirt as if that would do anything to steady my nerves. Dr. Phillips, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s, met me just outside Nina's room. She held a tablet, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Bennett, we ran a toxicology report on your sister-in-law. The substance we found in her system, it's not something that appears in food or beverages by accident." I exhaled slowly. I didn't think so. The levels were high enough to cause severe neurological symptoms if left untreated. Had she consumed more, or had this been administered repeatedly over time? She trailed off, her meaning clear. "It would have killed me." I nodded. "I need to tell you something," I said, holding up my phone. "I have a recording. You'll want to hear this." We stepped into a quiet room, and I played it for her. James's whispered panic. Nina's shock. The confession that this had all been meant for me. Dr. Phillips's lips thinned as she listened. When the recording ended, she met my gaze. "You need to take this to the police immediately," she said. "Already done," I replied. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "The toxicology results will support your case," she said. "The police will likely request samples from your home as well, to see if this substance has been introduced into your system before." The thought made my stomach turn. Had James been poisoning me for months? I thought back to every time I had felt sick after eating something he prepared. The unexplained nausea, the sudden dizziness, the days when I had been too weak to leave bed. How many times had he done this? "Mrs. Bennett," the doctor's voice softened. "I don't mean to alarm you, but I would strongly recommend getting tested yourself. If you've experienced any unexplained symptoms in recent months, it's possible you've been exposed in lower doses." I nodded slowly. "I'll do that." As I stepped out into the hallway, I saw Detective Mendoza approaching. "Mrs. Bennett, we need you to come with us," she said, her tone professional but firm. "Did James talk?" I asked. She tilted her head. "Not exactly. But Nina, she woke up." I followed her down the hallway to the interrogation room, my pulse hammering. Inside, Nina was sitting at a table looking pale and drained, but very much alive. An officer stood in the corner, watching her closely. When she saw me, something flickered in her eyes. Shame? Anger? Regret? I wasn't sure. "Christina," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know he was going to—" I crossed my arms. "You expect me to believe that?" "He told me it was just supposed to make you sick. He said if you missed work, if you lost a few clients, you'd be too distracted to compete with me." She let out a bitter laugh. "But I should have known. James never does things halfway." My stomach twisted. So it had been about my career. Nina and I worked at competing firms, always going after the same high-profile clients. I had outperformed her in recent months, landing contracts she had been fighting for. It wasn't just about work. "Was it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No," she admitted. "James wanted more. He wanted to make sure you were weak, dependent on him." I felt sick. Detective Mendoza stepped forward. "Mrs. Anderson, you understand that cooperating now won't erase your involvement in this, correct?" Nina nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know. I just want to make things right." "Then tell us everything," the detective said. And Nina did. She told them about the conversations with James, about how he had researched different substances, tested them in small amounts, about how he had manipulated her into going along with it, convincing her that she'd benefit too. And worst of all, about how long he had been doing it. "Since February," she admitted. "Maybe longer." My breath caught in my throat. Months. For months. I had been slowly poisoned, my body fighting against something I hadn't even known was there. "We need to search your home," Detective Mendoza said. "If he's been doing this for that long, there may still be evidence. Take whatever you need," I said. As they led Nina away to process her formal statement, I sat down, pressing my hands against my face. I had thought this was just about today, just about a single attempt. But this had been happening for so much longer. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. The search of my home turned up exactly what I feared. Hidden in James's desk were small vials, labeled with medical names I didn't recognize. Detective Mendoza handed me a file. These were found in his email drafts. I opened it, scanning the messages. Emails to online suppliers. Conversations with a friend who worked at a pharmaceutical company. Detailed notes on my schedule, my habits, my health. James had been keeping track of my reactions. He had been experimenting on me. I swallowed hard. "What happens now?" "Now," the detective said, "we build the case. And with everything we've found, James won't be getting out of this anytime soon." The trial lasted 3 weeks. I sat in the courtroom, watching as the prosecution laid out every piece of evidence. The vials, the emails, the text messages between James and Nina, the toxicology reports from my own tests, confirming that I had been slowly poisoned for months. James tried to deny it. Then he tried to blame Nina. Then he claimed it was all just a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. There was just the truth. And the truth was damning. The jury took only 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. On multiple counts, including attempted murder. When James was sentenced to 20 years, he didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. But I saw the regret in his eyes. Not regret for what he had done, regret that he had failed. 1 year later, I stood in my new office, looking out at the city skyline. I had moved forward, built something better, reclaimed my life. And James? He was sitting in a prison cell, thinking about the woman he had tried to destroy, thinking about how I had outplayed him in the end. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about surviving, thriving, winning, and making sure they know it. As I stepped out of my office, the cool evening air filled my lungs. The city lights shimmered below, a stark contrast to the darkness I had emerged from. It had been a year since James was sentenced, since Nina had turned on him in a last-ditch effort to save herself. She had gotten a reduced sentence, but she lost everything: her career, her reputation, her freedom. James, on the other hand, had lost even more. I had heard through legal updates that he struggled in prison. He wasn't the charming, confident man he had once pretended to be. Without his carefully curated facade, without the control he once had over me, he was nothing. But the worst part for him? He knew I had won. My business had grown. My career had flourished. Clients trusted me more than ever. The story of how I survived had spread, not as a scandal, but as a testament to resilience. I had built something unshakable. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message. From a number I didn't recognize, but I knew exactly who it was from. "Are you happy now?" I stared at the screen, my lips curving slightly. Was I? Yes, because happiness wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making him suffer, though I knew he was. Happiness was about freedom, about standing on my own, about never being controlled again. I deleted the message. James had spent so long trying to destroy me. Now he had nothing left but his own regret. I had my future. He had his past. And that was the real victory. Life has a way of revealing the truth, no matter how hard people try to hide it. Betrayal, no matter how well planned, always leaves cracks. And when those cracks widen, everything crumbles. Have you ever seen the truth come out in a way no one expected? How did it change your life? Let's talk in the comments.